Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Louvre, The Many Lives of the World's Most Famous Museum, by James Gardner, narrated by Graham Halstead. Preface. In telling the story of the Louvre, I have proceeded simultaneously along three fronts: the architectural, the institutional, and the historical. That is to say that the present book describes the evolution of the building known as the Louvre, from its earliest foundations as a medieval fortress to the completion of I.M. Pei's glass pyramid 8 centuries later. But the book also considers the institutional genesis of the great museum that has now inhabited that structure for over 200 years, animating it as a soul animates a body. Finally, and no less essentially, the book explores the crucial role that the Louvre has played in the history of France and its ruling dynasties, from the time of the Third Crusade, through the Revolution, to the Second World War, and beyond. Although this tale is well worth telling, it is also one of nearly incalculable complexity. Architectural history is to art history as three-dimensional chess is to the standard version of the game. In general, a painting or sculpture is created by one artist in a fairly abbreviated span of time, and it remains in that final condition, shielded from the elements, for as long as its material foundations hold up. But a building, especially a great building, is often a labor of centuries, engaging the talents of generations of architects and codifying in stone the often discordant whims of several great dynastic families. It is subject to constant attack from the elements, and not infrequently from the fusillades of invading armies and the vicissitudes of siege warfare. Perhaps no single structure on the planet exhibits this complex and protracted genesis as well as the Louvre, which, for more than 800 years, has been in a process of becoming. What we see today, not counting what has been destroyed beyond recall, is the result of some 20 discrete building campaigns over 500 years. And indeed, the building's history goes back 3.5 centuries before the construction of the earliest structures that are now visible above ground. But traditionally, architects and their patrons seek to belie such troubled gestation, and to persuade visitors that they stand before a serenely unified project born of a single building campaign. And that is how most visitors see the Louvre, and how, for a long time, I, too, saw this incomparable palace. I was aware that there were stylistic disparities among its parts, and that it had emerged over a period of centuries. But one day, as I was entering the grounds of the Louvre for perhaps the 100th time, it suddenly came home to me that I knew almost nothing of the story behind what I was seeing. As I began to look into the matter, my initial curiosity grew upon itself, resulting in the book that you now listen to. In several respects, this book is antithetical to the one I wrote immediately before it, A History of the City of Buenos Aires. That book engaged a massive subject, an entire city, that had been relatively little studied, and, to the extent to which it had been studied at all, in a rather unsystematic, even shoddy way. By contrast, the focus of the present book is a single object, although admittedly one of the largest on earth, every square inch of which has been scrutinized by the most eminent and exacting art and architectural historians, not only in France, but throughout the world. My skills and training being those of a cultural critic rather than a researcher in recondite fields, I freely admit that I have left archival inquiries to the many scholars who are far more practiced and proficient in such pursuits. I am also delighted to acknowledge my debt to the 3-volume Histoire du Louvre, edited by Geneviève Bresque-Bautier and Guillaume Fonquenelle, which appeared at precisely the moment when I began writing my book. Engaging the talents of nearly 100 scholars and extending to nearly 2 million words, that book is a summa of archival research, intended mainly for scholars in the field, into every imaginable aspect of the history of the Louvre as a building and an institution. In the interests of housekeeping, the listener will allow me to make several somewhat disconnected points. The first is that, for the sake of consistency, I have numbered the floors in the Louvre and elsewhere after the European fashion rather than the American. The lowest externally visible part of a building is its ground floor, followed by the first floor, which in the United States is called the second floor. The Louvre thus has 3 levels, not counting several levels below grade: the ground floor, the first floor, and the second floor. Next, it should be stated that the entire western side of the Louvre, as it opens outward to the Champs-Élysées and the Arc de Triomphe, was once occupied by a great palace, les Tuileries, that was integral and physically connected to that architectural complex that we call the Louvre. This palace burned to the ground under the Communards in 1871. Of necessity, I refer to it frequently in the course of the present narrative, but far less for its own sake than for its influence on the evolution of the Louvre as we know it today. A book of this sort necessarily mentions a great number of paintings, sculptures, and architectural elements, more than could be conveniently included among the illustrations. But if this book has a generous complement of images, it has been written in the full awareness of the new realities of the Internet. An illustration of every work of art mentioned in the book can be found with relative ease online. The listener is therefore encouraged to seek these images at that bountiful source. Introduction. Before the Louvre was a museum, it was a palace, and before that a fortress, and before that a plot of earth, much like any other. In French there is a term for such a place, un lieu dit, for which no real equivalent exists in English. This term refers to an area that is familiar to the inhabitants of a region and that may have a name, but whether populated sparsely or not at all, it has no official legal recognition. Through what would become the 3 main open spaces of the modern Louvre, the Cour Carrée, the Cour Napoléon, and Place du Carrousel, human beings passed and repassed for thousands of years before the ancestors of the Celts and Romans ever began their migration from the Eurasian steppe westward to the territory of modern France. We know this because, simultaneously with the vast construction at the Louvre in the 1980s, resulting in the museum we know today, extensive archaeological work was carried out in those 3 main open spaces. The site of the Cour Napoléon yielded up pottery dating back more than 7,000 years, while the skeletal remains of a man who died over 4,000 years ago were unearthed near the Arc du Carrousel and what is now the underground bus depot of the Louvre. Toward the end of the Gallo-Roman period, in the first centuries of the Common Era, 2 farms, one in the Cour Napoléon, the other at the site of the Place du Carrousel, raised cattle and pigs, and abounded in plum, pear, and apple trees, as well as vineyards. At some point, long before King Philippe Auguste of France decided in 1191 to build a fortress on this spot of land, the entire area acquired a mysterious name, Le Louvre, which has defied all efforts to decipher it. What we do know is that Philippe did not name his fortress Le Louvre or anything else, since it was really nothing more than a piece of military infrastructure designed to shelter a garrison. Standing outside of Paris at the time of its construction, it merely came to be known by the name that, for centuries, human beings had called the land where it stood, Le Louvre. I emphasize the placeness of the Louvre in part because everything about it today seems designed to reject and cover up its infinitely humble, elemental origins. Certainly since the time of Louis XIV in the late 17th century, if not before, the Louvre has contrived, both in its general design and in its specific details, to appear almost superhuman. Nearly half a mile long from end to end, it is one of the largest man-made structures on the planet, so large that no human eye can take in its entirety from any angle on the ground. But it defies our common humanity in other ways as well. Although much of the structure that the visitor sees today is from the 17th century, most of it was either built, rebuilt, or reclad in the 19th century. In this sense, the Louvre is a 19th century project, even if its formal components owe a great deal to the architectural aesthetics of 2 centuries before. At its completion in 1857, the Louvre was the defining architectonic triumph of Napoleon III, if not the material embodiment of the entire Second Empire. Everything about French culture at that time had such superhuman longings. These aspirations are expressed both in the peerless symmetries of the Cour Napoleon and in the extravagant neo-Baroque language in which the entire complex was reconceived under Napoleon III. There is a hardness, a massiveness to the Louvre, with its burnished railings and marble floors and gilded capitals, that seems to repudiate human frailty. It is the virtuosic expression of something that reaches deep into French culture since the time of the Sun King, a tyrannous, all-conquering discipline, expressed in the faultless couplets of Racine and Boileau, and the ballet en pointe of Jean-Georges Noverre, in the culinary precision of Carême and Escoffier, and in the obsessive grammatical precision of Mallarmé and Marcel Proust. Perhaps more than any other building ever made, the Louvre stands as an implicit reproach, a programmatic rejection of the art and architecture that the West favors today, with its asymmetries, its puerile rebellions, its clamorous proclamation of its own insufficiency. It is as though in the pavilions and colonnades of the Louvre, civilization itself stood in pitched battle not only with human nature and all its weakness, but also with Mother Earth, with all those clumps of grass and viscous clay that once occupied this parcel of land and that continue to lie beneath it, waiting for the moment when, at some point in remote posterity, they will regain their former empire. The place that is the Louvre occupies a position of radical centrality, or so it would have us believe. If Paris is figuratively the center of the world, as it certainly seemed to be in the 19th century, the Louvre is the center of Paris. This is literally true. The circumference of the city, represented by the highway known as le périphérique, spins around the Louvre like a pinwheel at a radius of about 3 miles in every direction. But here again, the origins of the Louvre belie this assertion of centrality. Today there is as much Paris to the west of the Louvre as to the east, but when the original fortress was built around 1200, it was a military outpost just west of the newly built walls of the city. This is to say that by strategy and design, the Louvre was eccentric to Paris, which lay entirely to the east. And the Louvre would preserve that status until a new wall, built around 1370, finally assimilated it into the city. But even then the Louvre stood at the western edge of the capital and would remain there for the next 500 years. Most of the great events that influenced the histories of England and the United States did not occur in London and New York, respectively, but on some field of battle in open country. And yet there is probably no city in the world in which history, the history not just of France but of Europe and beyond, played out more consistently than Paris. By the same token, there is no part of Paris denser in historical consequence than the Louvre. This heritage will surprise many visitors to the museum who may not even realize that it ever served any other function than that of a repository of great art. In fact, although the Louvre has existed for more than 800 years, it has been a museum for only a little over 200 of those years. This fact is not to deny, of course, the importance of the Louvre in the history of art. The museum's role in creating the grand narrative of art history should be fairly obvious. The Louvre was the first and is almost certainly the greatest encyclopedic museum in the world, bringing together the art of almost every age and almost every region. What is less widely known, however, is that the Louvre, in addition to being a veritable nursery of architectural innovation, was more directly responsible for the actual production of Western painting and sculpture than any other institution yet conceived. Not only did Nicolas Poussin show up every day to paint the ceiling of La Grande Galerie, although he didn't get far before he abandoned a task he clearly saw as a distasteful burden. For more than 100 years after Louis XIV abandoned Paris for Versailles in 1682, the Louvre was repurposed as an academy where the greatest artists of France were given studios, free of charge, in which to create whatever they wished. Here the charm of local specificity asserts itself. We can point to the very spot in the northern wing of the Cour Carrée where Jean-Honoré Fragonard painted so many of the world's most endearing paintings. On the first floor of the southern wing, Chardin and Boucher were hard at work in what are now the Egyptian galleries. The concept of the salon, the salons of 1759 and 1761, for example, which lives on today in the Whitney Biennial and the Biennale di Venezia, was born in and named for the Salon Carré, a few steps to the right of the winged Victory of Samothrace, where the works of Giotto and Duccio now appear. But it is one of the paradoxes of the Louvre that, although it is among the most frequented places in the world, it is also one of the least understood. Such confusion is hardly surprising, since there is probably no one structure, or more accurately, no complex of structures in architectural history whose gestation was as protracted or convoluted. What we see today is the result of no fewer than 20 distinct building campaigns that drew on the very diverse and unequal talents of scores of architects over 8 centuries. And yet, because there is no glaring disparity among the many parts of this complex, it rarely presents itself as a question to the common visitor. Most tourists enter the Louvre through the Pyramides, never realizing that everything they see dates to the 1850s or soon after. In a strictly historical sense, then, they are hardly seeing the Louvre at all, at least not what a Parisian of 1600 or 1800 would have understood by the term. In fact, what they are seeing can be divided conceptually into 4 main parts. The palace of the Louvre, properly understood, consisted of the 4 wings that now make up the Cour Carrée, occupying the eastern extremity of the Louvre complex. For most of its history, when people spoke of the Louvre, they meant this square structure, and only this. But if you turn west with the Pyramides and the Cour Carrée at your back, you will see the Arc de Triomphe several miles in the distance at the top of the Champs-Élysées. You should not be seeing the Arc de Triomphe in the distance, however, and this brings us to the second component of the Louvre. The reason you can see the arch at all is that the Tuileries Palace, which was begun in 1564 and should be blocking your view, was burnt to the ground by revolutionaries during the Paris Commune of 1871. But although the Tuileries Palace no longer exists, almost every part of the Louvre that you see today was created in response to it. For example, to the south lies the third component of the Louvre, a stunningly long and narrow building, half a kilometer in length, and known as the Grande Galerie. For most visitors to Paris, even for most Parisians, this is the Louvre, because it contains those paintings by Leonardo da Vinci and other Italian masters that they have come to see. And yet this gallery was created as little more than a covered passageway leading between the Louvre Palace and the Tuileries Palace, which thereafter became part of the Louvre complex. As for everything else you see, the entire northern half of the Louvre, except for one section built around 1805, did not exist before the 1850s. Instead, this entire area was filled for centuries with churches, a hospital, and many houses great and small, some of them little better than huts. In chronicling the dynastic and urbanistic forces that influenced each stage of the Louvre's evolution, as well as the myriad events that took place within the walls of the fortress, then the palace, and later the museum, I will argue that the Louvre is as great a work of art as anything it contains. It would be fairly easy to argue that the facades of the Aile Lescaut and the Colonnade all the way at the eastern end of the Louvre should be so considered. But I foresee some resistance when the discussion turns to the Escalier d'Arrue or to the design of the interior of the Grande Galerie. In making this argument, I offer up a totalizing view of the Louvre complex, every part of which is something one should know about. Every element of it that crosses one's line of vision potentially deserves attention, not least the murals of Romanelli and Lebrun that adorn the ceilings of the museum, but that tend to be overlooked because they do not sit politely in a frame. comprising nearly 400,000 objects from 50 centuries and 200 generations of human culture. The Louvre is almost certainly the greatest collection of human artifice ever assembled in one place. And yet those objects are not simply there. Vast, overarching historical and cultural forces brought each of those objects into the galleries of the museum. The Louvre is, among other things, a vast, indiscriminate cocktail of princely collections purchased or purloined over the course of centuries. Not all of it is good, which is of some interest in itself, shedding light as it does on the ever-shifting and infinitely unstable progress of taste. More importantly, every work of art that it contains has its story. The Mona Lisa is there because François I bought it from Leonardo da Vinci shortly before the painter died. As regards Raphael's great Saint Michael routing the demon, Pope Leo X gave it to François I in hopes that he would return the favor by invading the Ottoman Empire. And Veronese's Wedding Feast at Cana, one of the largest works ever painted on canvas, occupies a wall of the Salle des États because Napoleon Bonaparte stole it from the Venetians and never gave it back. These and 400,000 other stories like them all come together to form the Musée du Louvre, the latest chapter, and surely not the last, in the evolution of that little corner of the earth that rests upon the right bank of the Seine. 1. The origins of the Louvre. Most visitors to the Louvre come to see the Italian paintings, and especially the Mona Lisa. This part of the museum, the Aile de Non, is flooded with light that pours in from the ceiling and the windows that look out onto the Seine. Even the gilded frames seem to give off light. To reach it one must ascend, climbing the grand Escalier d'Arru and turning right at the winged Victory of Samothrace before emerging into the brilliance of the Salon Carré. But there is another part of the Louvre, rather less frequented, that seems to belong to a different world. Although it does indeed receive its share of visitors, it is unlikely to be the reason for which they have come to the museum. To reach it, one descends into the earth, into something like twilight or even night, to find the remains of the original Louvre, the fortress that Philippe Auguste built at the end of the 12th century, and the palace into which it evolved under Charles V, late in the 14th century. For fully 200 years after the last visible traces of the medieval Louvre were razed to the ground in 1660, these subterranean realms were completely forgotten. Not until 1866 did the archaeologist Adolphe Berthier, on a hunch, begin to excavate the site. He discovered the intact remains of the soubassement, the 21-foot-high foundation of what had once been the eastern and northern walls of the palace, hidden beneath the modern cour carrée. But these stunning discoveries would soon be forgotten by all but a few scholars, not to be seen again for another century. Only when the great work began on the Grand Louvre, that pharaonic labor initiated by President François Mitterrand in the mid-1980s, was a systematic excavation finally undertaken, not only of the original palace, but also of the Cour Napoleon, where I.M. Pei's Pyramide now sits, and several hundred meters to the west, the area surrounding the Arc du Carrousel. The circumstances under which the Louvre came into being, as well as the reasons for its construction in the first place, are intimately involved with the form and nature of Paris itself at the end of the 12th century. Consider the magnificent opening of Victor Hugo's 1831 novel Notre-Dame de Paris, better known in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Today it is 348 years, 6 months and 19 days since the Parisians awoke to the clamor of all the bells resounding mightily in the threefold enclosure of the town, La Cité, the University, and the city. There is nothing arbitrary in that wording. The town, the university, and the city succinctly sum up the tripartite division of Paris from medieval times down to the French Revolution. Hugo was writing about the 1480s. The town occupied the Île de la Cité, the largest island in the Seine and the natural bridging point between its right and left banks. This island had been the center of government and religion as far back as the Roman Empire, when, 700 feet west of today's Notre Dame, a palace was built that would serve for 1,000 years as the official residence of the kings of France. Immediately to the south on the left bank rose the university, established in the year 1200 through the consolidation of several pre-existent monastic schools. And finally there was La Ville, the city. Not accidentally, Hugo mentions this part last. It had neither the royal and ecclesiastical glamour of the Ile de la Cité, nor the prestige of the schools and monasteries of the left bank. And yet, by the time the Louvre in its earliest form was completed around 1200, La Ville accounted for most of Paris. This was its center of population and seat of commerce, the home of a restless and enterprising bourgeoisie. For centuries to come, the growth of Paris would occur here, while the left bank largely stagnated, and the immoderate growth of this part of Paris forced the king, Philippe II, to build the fortress of the Louvre. Known to history as Philippe Auguste, he was one of the ablest and most powerful monarchs of the Capetian dynasty that ruled France from 987 to 1328. But when he ascended the throne at 15 in 1180, few kingdoms were in as weak or perilous a state. The realm he inherited was almost entirely blocked from the Atlantic by the Angevin kings of England, Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, and John Lackland, who controlled the western third of modern France from Normandy down to the Pyrenees. To make matters worse, a wedge of English-controlled land jutted eastward along the Massif Central, cleaving his kingdom in two. Meanwhile, the eastern third was in the hands of the Duke of Burgundy, hardly a trusted ally. All told, the territory that Philippe ruled at the outset of his reign constituted barely a third of modern France, and even this was chipped away at many points by ecclesiastical lands, ultimately subject to the Pope in Rome. By the end of his 43-year reign, however, he had wrested most of western France from the English and greatly increased the crown lands, the territory that belonged to him outright, the source of his power and wealth. Throughout his reign, Philippe was constantly on the move. In addition to embarking on the Third Crusade to the Holy Land and vanquishing the English at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, he centralized the administration of his kingdom and crushed the Albigensian heretics in Provence. And yet some of his greatest contributions were made in Paris itself. At this time the capital was undergoing an energetic urban development that, relative to its earlier condition, could be compared to its expansion under Henri IV in the 17th century or under Napoleon III in the 19th. Although it is common to treat the capital and even the French monarchy itself as weak and marginal at this time, no city of the second rank could have built one of the largest and greatest cathedrals in Christendom, Notre Dame de Paris. Louis XII had begun construction in the 1160s, and Philippe Auguste, his son, substantially completed the work by 1200. At this time as well, the convent schools on the left bank were consolidated into what would become one of the finest universities of Europe, the Sorbonne. Meanwhile, there could be no greater testament to the vigor of the right bank than the new commercial area of Les Halles, which Louis VI created in 1137, and Philippe Auguste greatly expanded early in his reign. At the same time, he enlarged the nearby cemetery known as the Cimetière des Innocents, thus creating one of the largest open spaces in a city that had very few of them. And for the first time, he paved over some of the city's principal streets. As cause and consequence of these actions, in the year 1200 the city's population surpassed 100,000 for the first time since the fall of the Roman Empire. It was precisely this frantic pace of development that moved Philippe to construct a great wall, or enceinte, more than 3 miles in circumference, around his capital. And the Louvre itself was nothing more or less than a consequence of the wall. This structure was to be but a small part of a vast system of fortifications that would comprise 20 castles throughout France. Because an English onslaught was most likely to come from the northwest, Philippe began to fortify the right bank, the northern half of the city, in 1190, just before he embarked on the Third Crusade. This part of the wall was completed in 1202, The less urgent fortification of the left bank began in 1192, shortly after Philippe's return, and was built by 1215. In one of the ironies of history...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?